And this is just such a fascinating read, particularly in light of the events over the past few days, the shooting down of the the Chinese weather balloon, and the to and fro that we've seen from Beijing and Washington. When you take a look at a diplomatic incident like this, what does the reaction and the handling tell you about where the two major superpowers sit?
Well, I think it tells us that the kind of intense competition and at times confrontation between the two superpowers is here to stay. So we saw last year there were some more diplomatic overtures between the two countries, and many people might have hoped that that might mean that the two countries would have closer and more stable relations in 2023. But now we can clearly see with this balloon incident that China is not going to be stepping back from its pattern of using its military capability in a much more assertive way.
So do we also kind of assume with the cancelling of Antony Blinken's trip, the friction that is now intensified, that the guardrails that are supposedly in place are not that solid, and that there are clearly domestic priorities that are sort of taking effect here?
Well, I think the focus of Blinken's visit was supposed to be about putting in place some of those guardrails that were discussed at a higher level when Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden met last year. But of course, given the incident with the balloon and the US response of shooting it down, I think the US decision was that there was no way that the atmosphere could be established for those kind of talks to take place. So we'll have to wait and see when the time is going to be right.
Tell us a little bit about the Asia Power Index, Susannah, and whether this really also could give you an indication of the feelings towards China given all of these international incidents.
Well, the Asia Power Index shows that overall the United States remains the most powerful country in the region, more powerful than China. And according to the way that we measure power, the US leads China on 6 out of 8 measures. So it still has very strong, for example, defense networks with the region. Its military capability is still higher than what China has. But China also has certain advantages, especially in terms of its economic relationships with the region. So thinking about its trade and investment as a big source of its regional influence.
The U.S., of course, has been trying to court India's favor as well to even gain more influence in the region. What role is India playing at this point?
Well, I think the assumption that many people have is that India will be a key part of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, but the Asia Power Index does call that into question because it really shows that India's influence is quite patchy. It's quite weak on the economic side in terms of regional engagement, and its influence is heavily concentrated in South Asia. So that means that it's quite unclear what role India would really be playing in terms of major East Asian flashpoints like South China Sea or Taiwan.
What does it mean for middle powers when there's so much uncertainty between the US and China? Because you take a look at Australia, obviously, which has been burnt before by sort of sticking its neck out as a US ally. Is there a better strategy? Because I know the Singapore model, for example, was always lauded as being able to walk that line.
Well, the Southeast Asian countries overall for their size perform quite strongly in the Asia Power Index because they are diplomatically active, they're outward looking, they're networked, and Singapore is the prime example of that. But I think what the Asia Power Index suggests is that ultimately we're going to be in a region that is defined by bipolar rivalry between the two superpowers rather than the more multipolar system that some people might be hoping for.